So looking at a couple of cases here, we'll start with Uzbekistan. Again, remember, Islam Karimov rose up in power as a technocrat. He was a bureaucratic elite who served at Moscow's Gosplan, which was the economic planning department branch, in Uzbekistan, and then moved into the Ministry of Finance. And thanks to being a yes man, aka a potential puppet, uh, and thanks also in part to the Fergana riots, which led to the sacking of the first secretary Nishanov, Karimov moved into power in 1989. So again, he profited from being a yes man, but also thanks to Gorbachev's purge of Uzbekistan's party. Now, looking at the reference point, all Karimov had to do is point to Tajikistan in the early 1990s. So really, from 1992 to probably the end of the 1990s, he looked to Tajikistan, and before that he looked to Afghanistan, and throughout the period also to Afghanistan. So, for example, there was a billboard which read, "Stability is the treasure house of the Uzbek people and must be preserved." This is a billboard that I still saw back in 1999. Um, and Karimov made himself the symbol of this stability. And by that I mean look back when we talked about nationalism. You need a strong-handed ruler who would ensure order, like Tamerlane, right? Amr Timur. Karimov put his face on all the billboards around the country. More important was his slogan on these billboards, which encouraged duty, promised the strength of the Uzbek state. So these were all the things that Karimov was doing, using a reference point consistently to put these down. With reference to electoral legitimacy, you didn't have free and you didn't have fair elections that brought him to electoral victory in 1991. But once he came in there, it was all about legitimacy, and he moved to strengthen the executive. And he made it into a presidential state. With respect to the Constitution, he legally strengthened his own role through the Constitution, ensuring that his legitimacy trickled down. So he appointed regional leaders who were obedient to him, and then they would appoint people under them. So in reality, very little changed from the communist period to independence. The Communist Party head became the president. The Communist Party headquarters became the presidential palace. So even the symbols remained the same. Karimov also moved to lower the influence of minorities to the extent that this was safe. He pushed them out of cabinet positions, the heads of departments. He made all these positions, for the most part, Uzbek, and some Russians, but for the most part, Uzbek. In terms of nationalism, he reinterpreted the distant past. So again, he talked about Tamerlane, and he also linked himself to this very important national character. Again, strength and wisdom. But he also addressed the more concrete and recent past. For example, he rehabilitated Rashidov, the former first secretary who'd been blamed for the cotton scandal. By rehabilitation, again, the term refers to this legal restoration. So Rashidov had been legally attacked. He had been humiliated for being involved in this cotton scandal, which, as you recall, most Uzbeks thought that was profoundly unfair. It was targeted against them and Central Asians, but Uzbeks in particular. And so now Karimov comes to power and he rehabilitates Rashidov. He says, hey, he was actually a good man doing what he could for the Uzbek people. Others are also rehabilitated. And he goes even further. He declares that thousands were unjustly persecuted as a result of this cotton scandal, but also even going further back. And so he opens, for example, a museum and has a truth commission which looks at I mentioned this before, the Russian and the Soviet periods. So looking at all the bad things the Russians have done to us, and transforms the communist experience to the Russian experience. So yes, I was a member of the Communist Party, the head of the Communist Party, but it wasn't the communists who did anything bad to us. It was the Russians who pushed us around and did these bad things. So that's the case of Uzbekistan. In Turkmenistan, we've got similar reference points, Afghanistan and then Tajikistan. Turkmenbashi Niyazov declared early on that, quote, in the first stage of the transition period, we will establish firm control in order not to permit the blazing up of interethnic or tribal conflicts. And so how does he sell himself later? He sells himself as the one who neutralized the threat of civil war. Also, with respect to electoral legitimacy, like in Uzbekistan with a bit of a twist, He held a referendum on backing him as the head of Turkmenistan in 1991. So he didn't even have real elections. He had a referendum. And he got, of course, 94% of the vote. Then in June 1992, with a very abbreviated electoral campaign, he became president with 99.5% of the vote. Again, clearly these were not free. They were not fair. The same thing happens with the 1994 referendum, giving him a second term without elections. The country had about a population of 3 million, and everyone except for about 212 people in the country supported his referendum. So, bringing us to constitutional empowerment, by this point, Turkmenbashi Niyazov had ensured local executive branches were appointed by himself. He repeatedly dismisses them for poor cotton harvest figures, for other reasons. So this cyclical pattern, which is something that we often find in personalistic regimes, where the person in power is afraid that people will aggregate too much power, and so he switches them out constantly to keep them on edge and to keep them loyal to him, and to make sure that no one can create their own sort of dominion. Where was I? So, he often rules by decree. Opposition has been weakened, obviously, under him, but it's also been weakened anyway by tribal identifications and the absence of a sizable intelligentsia within Turkmenistan. Again, remember that a large part of the Turkmen population's in a diaspora, some in Moscow, some in Iran, and in other parts of the world. Those intellectuals that do exist, and the oppositionists, I should say, that do exist, have been subject to harassment, incarceration, death. Occasionally, there are breaks or rumors of a coup attempt, which is launched by discontent elites, but nothing's come out of any of these things. There's also been some opposition in Moscow, remember, again, where Turkmen informal organizations originated, but they haven't actually made a dent within the country's politics. Now, nationalism, again, this is a great case where you've combined nationalism with the personalization of power. So the president in Turkmenistan is not just an individual, but, quote, a symbol of statehood. So the president's face is everywhere. Everything is named after him. This was the whole personality cult that Niyazov created for himself. Again, keep in mind, Niyazov dies in 2006 or 2007? I think 2006. Maybe it was later. Okay. Czekaj means wait in Polish. I'm actually in Poland recording these. Well, I'll come back to you with the date a little bit later because I'm blanking on it. I just remember where I was at the time. I was in D.C. When he died, and his successor comes to power, but he reverses. He doesn't go forward with the cult of personality. He doesn't seem to reverse it very much either. So the president is still at one with the state. Another important aspect here, though, is that being a strong state for Niyazov means being a self-sufficient one. And so historically, 95% of Turkmen cotton and natural gas was sent to other republics. And now he wants to harness these things and make Turkmenistan into a strong state. And especially he banked on gas being able to be sold on the on the real world market and earn a lot more money for it. He's also gone out of his way, when we talk about nationalism, to ensure that Russians feel at home there, pronouncing that close links with Russia are essential, despite this positive neutrality policy that he's oriented himself around. So neutral as a country, but keep close links with Russia. And foreign criticism has been easily rebutted in both cases. Turkmenistan has always said to Russia, that we deserve to be an independent state, but we'll work with you in our own interests. And then to the west, the Turkmen have often come under attack for their failure to develop democracy. And this is a classic sort of Central Asian stance, which is looking at the United States, for example. You had 200 years to develop democracy, so give us some time. Okay? So nationalism and populism. So going into the case of Kazakhstan, the last case which I'll talk about, Nazarbayev is a man of two nationalities. He grew up speaking Kazakh, understanding his own ethnicity, but he was also a product of the Soviet system, of upward mobility within the Soviet system. So he's the ideal representative of, quote, dual patriotisms. He'd been I don't even know how you pronounce the metal guys, metallurgist. He was a good proletariat. He joined the local Communist Party. He moved up the ranks to second secretary. And then remember, after those December 1986 riots, he became first secretary, someone that the Russians would accept, but also that the Kazakhs would accept. In terms of a reference point, his reference point, interestingly, was always the Soviet Union. We need it. He was an economist. He kept stressing the importance of interdependence among the republics. He said that the death of the Soviet Union would be economic suicide. The not going forward with a Commonwealth of Independent States, once the death of the Soviet Union became clear, would also be economic suicide. Quote, "It is impossible to construct heaven in one region or in one republic." But he also had Tajikistan, and he also referred to the high cost of instability, and in particular the danger of the ethnic situation, which in Kazakhstan, again, revolved around the potential for ethnic separatism, primarily from Russians in the north, but you also had pockets of Uzbeks in the south, Kyrgyz as well. In terms of electoral legitimacy, he was first made president by parliament in 1991, and then he had somewhat free and fair elections, pretty free and fair for a Central Asian state, which brought him electoral victory in 1991. And then it became about legitimacy. He moved to strengthen the executive and in the future show himself to be unafraid to dissolve the parliament when it did not do as he wished, which would, he hoped, lead to some degree of self-censorship, so that people in parliament would actually go along with what he wanted, his program, and it worked to a large degree, so that they wouldn't be pushed out. In terms of the Constitution, he legally strengthened his own role through the Constitution, but it wasn't personalistic. It hasn't been personalistic like Niazov and Karimov. He promised lots of economic rights to his people, the right to vacation, the right to housing, medical care, education. He still wanted to be, able to manage the economy, so we've got a strong presidency, though. Quote, "In this vitally important sphere, there is no room for an orgy of democracy." So there's the Kazakh, one of the most democratic in Central Asia, democratic being a soft authoritarian really here. I'm talking about an orgy of democracy. In terms of nationalism, there were expectations that Nazarbayev would come and he would correct history, he would empower the local language. And he went this direction, but he went very carefully in this direction, because he was scared of both Kazakh and Russian nationalists, and the tension was everywhere. So he had, for example, a completely Kazakh cabinet, but then he appointed a prime minister who was an ethnic Russian. He stressed his own atheism, but then he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. He promised to support the return of Kazakhs who had been sent all around, especially in Mongolia, but other Soviet republics. But it was a very costly process. There were tensions in the economic sphere as well. Privatization of farms, but to other ethnic groups in the country as well, not just to Kazakhs. So it wasn't just that ethnic Kazakhs had the right to buy this land. Again, remember that land was a major issue when they were coming up with constitutions around Central Asia. So he allowed ethnic Russians to buy into this too. So these are just three cases which highlight the use of reference points, electoral legitimacy, constitutional empowerment, and nationalism. So when we go into the next class, we will talk more about popular opinion. And so we'll stop right there.